Have you ever wondered what it takes to remain faithful when everything around you is falling apart? When the very ground beneath your feet seems to crumble and the choices you face could cost you everything you hold dear? Picture this. You're living in a foreign land, serving under a king who doesn't share your beliefs. You've built a life of integrity, earned respect through decades of faithful service, and then suddenly you're faced with a choice that will either compromise everything you believe in or potentially end your life. This isn't just a hypothetical scenario. This is exactly what happened to one man whose story has inspired millions for over 2,000 years. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most incredible accounts of faith under pressure ever recorded. The story of Daniel in the lion's den. But here's what most people miss about this story. It wasn't just about one night with some hungry lions. This was the culmination of a lifetime of choices, a testament to unwavering conviction, and a demonstration of what happens when someone refuses to bend their principles no matter the cost. I'm going to walk you through the real story behind this legendary event, reveal the political conspiracy that led to Daniel's predicament, and show you why this ancient account is more relevant to your life today than you might think. We'll explore the courage it takes to stand alone, the price of integrity, and discover what Daniel's example teaches us about facing our own lions in life. But first, let me set the stage for you. This isn't a fairy tale or a children's bedtime story. This is a historical account that took place in the powerful Babylonian Empire, in a world where kings held absolute power and religious freedom was a luxury few could afford. The year was approximately 539 BC. The mighty Babylonian Empire had just fallen to the Medo-Persian forces, and a new ruler named Darius the Mede had taken control. Imagine the chaos, the uncertainty, the complete upheaval of everything people had known. In times like these, survival meant adapting quickly to new rules, new leaders, and new ways of doing things. But there was one man who had already weathered multiple regime changes, who had served faithfully under different kings, and who had built a reputation that transcended political boundaries. His name was Daniel, and by this time, he was probably in his 80s. Think about that for a moment, an elderly man who had spent his entire adult life in exile, far from his homeland, serving foreign kings while never forgetting who he really was or what he truly believed. Daniel wasn't just any government official. He was one of the most trusted advisors in the empire, a man whose wisdom and integrity had earned him positions of incredible influence under multiple rulers. When Nebuchadnezzar ruled Babylon, Daniel was there. When Belshazzar held power, Daniel was there. And now, under Darius the Mede, Daniel was once again being recognized for his exceptional abilities. In Daniel chapter 6, verse 3, we read something remarkable. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Let that sink in. An elderly Jewish exile was about to be promoted to the highest position in the Persian Empire, second only to the king himself. But here's where the story takes a dramatic turn. Success and recognition don't always bring peace. Sometimes they bring problems you never expected. The other officials in Darius's administration were watching Daniel's rise with growing concern and jealousy. These were powerful men, governors and administrators, who controlled vast regions of the empire. They had worked their way up through the political system, made the right connections, played the political games that advancement typically required. And now they were watching an outsider, an elderly foreigner, being elevated above them all. Can you imagine their frustration, their anger, Here was a man who didn't share their culture, their religion, or even their background, yet the king trusted him more than any of them. So they did what people in power often do. When they feel threatened, they began looking for ways to eliminate the competition. Daniel chapter 6, verse 4 tells us, "At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him, because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent." Think about this for a moment. These were skilled politicians, men who knew how to find dirt on their opponents, how to uncover scandals and weaknesses that could be exploited. They launched what was essentially a full investigation into Daniel's life and career. They examined his financial records, his business dealings, his government decisions. They were looking for anything, any mistake, any compromise, any evidence of corruption they could use against him. But they found nothing. Absolutely nothing. In a world where political corruption was commonplace, where officials regularly used their positions for personal gain, Daniel's record was spotless. His integrity was unquestionable. His faithfulness to his duties was beyond reproach. After decades of public service, these men couldn't find a single legitimate charge to bring against him. This discovery should have ended their investigation, but instead, it led them to a chilling conclusion. If they couldn't attack Daniel's professional conduct, they would have to attack something else, his personal convictions. Listen to what they said in Daniel chapter 6, verse 5. "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." These words reveal something profound about Daniel's character. His colleagues recognized that there was one area of his life that was absolutely non-negotiable, his relationship with God. They knew that Daniel's faith wasn't just a private matter or a cultural tradition he observed when convenient. It was the driving force behind everything he did, the foundation of his integrity, and the one thing he would never compromise. So they hatched a plan that was as cunning as it was cruel. They would use Daniel's greatest strength, his unwavering faith, as the weapon to destroy him. The conspirators approached King Darius with what seemed like a reasonable request. They suggested that the king issue a royal decree establishing his supreme authority during this transitional period in the empire. For 30 days, no one would be allowed to petition any god or human being except King Darius himself. Anyone who violated this decree would be thrown into the lion's den. On the surface, this might have seemed like good politics. A new ruler establishing his authority, demanding loyalty, creating unity in a diverse empire. But the conspirators knew exactly what they were doing. They knew Daniel's daily habits, his commitment to prayer, his refusal to compromise his faith for political convenience. King Darius, perhaps flattered by the proposal, or convinced by his advisors' arguments about political necessity, signed the decree into law. And according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, once a royal decree was signed and sealed, it could not be changed, not even by the king himself. The trap was set, the law was in place. Now all they had to do was wait for Daniel to fall into it. But here's what the conspirators may not have fully understood about the man they were trying to destroy. Daniel had been facing tests of faith his entire life. As a young man, he had been taken captive from Jerusalem and brought to Babylon. He could have assimilated completely into Babylonian culture, abandoned his Jewish identity, and embraced the religion and customs of his captors. Instead, he chose to maintain his convictions while serving excellently in his new circumstances. When King Nebuchadnezzar demanded that everyone worship a golden image, Daniel's 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused and were thrown into a fiery furnace. Daniel had watched as they chose to face death rather than compromise their faith. He had seen God's miraculous deliverance when they emerged from the flames unharmed. Daniel had interpreted dreams for kings, delivered difficult messages that could have cost him his life, and consistently chosen obedience to God over personal safety or political advantage. This wasn't a man who was going to suddenly change his principles because of a new law or a new threat. So when Daniel learned about the decree that had been signed, he faced the same choice that believers have faced throughout history: compromise your faith or face the consequences. But Daniel's response reveals something extraordinary about true conviction. The Bible tells us in Daniel chapter 6, verse 10, "Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before." Notice those last 6 words, just as he had done before. Daniel didn't change his routine. He didn't try to find a compromise solution. He didn't pray in secret or modify his practice to avoid detection. He continued doing exactly what he had been doing for decades, praying 3 times a day, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, expressing his faith openly and consistently. This wasn't defiance for the sake of rebellion. This wasn't a political statement or an act of civil disobedience. This was simply a man continuing to live according to his deepest convictions, regardless of the external circumstances that had changed around him. The conspirators were watching, of course. They had positioned themselves to catch Daniel in the act of violating the king's decree. And when they saw him praying, they knew they had him. They rushed to King Darius with their accusation, probably barely able to contain their excitement. They had finally found a way to eliminate the man who had stood in their way, the official whose integrity and competence had made their own shortcomings more obvious. But something unexpected happened when they brought their charges to the king. Instead of being pleased that his decree was being enforced, Darius was distressed. The Bible tells us he was greatly disturbed and made every effort to rescue Daniel. He spent the entire day looking for a way to save his trusted advisor from the consequences of the law he himself had signed. This reaction reveals something important about Daniel's character and reputation. Even a pagan king recognized Daniel's worth and integrity. Darius wasn't eager to see Daniel punished. He desperately wanted to find a way to spare him. But the laws of the Medes and Persians were inflexible, and the conspirators were quick to remind the king that not even he could change a decree once it had been sealed. As evening approached, King Darius faced one of the most difficult decisions of his reign. He had to choose between his personal desire to protect Daniel and his obligation to uphold the law of the empire. The conspirators had cleverly trapped not just Daniel, but the king himself. And so, with great reluctance and obvious distress, King Darius gave the order. Daniel would be thrown into the lion's den. But before we continue with what happened next, I want you to consider something profound about this moment in the story. Daniel was about to face the ultimate test of his faith, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he had done everything right. His integrity had made him enemies. His faithfulness had put him in danger. His refusal to compromise had led him to this moment of crisis. This is where our story takes us beyond ancient history into timeless truth about what it means to live with conviction in a world that often rewards compromise. The evening air was heavy with tension as Daniel was led toward the den of lions. Picture this scene. torches flickering in the darkness, the sound of sandaled feet on stone pathways, and in the center of it all, an elderly man walking with quiet dignity toward what everyone assumed would be his death. But here's what strikes me most about this moment. Daniel wasn't dragging his feet or pleading for mercy. He wasn't frantically trying to negotiate a last-minute deal or promising to change his ways if given another chance. According to the historical account, he walked toward that den with the same calm composure he had displayed throughout his entire career. The lion's den wasn't just a metaphor or a figure of speech. Archaeological evidence suggests these were actual pits carved into rock, designed specifically for execution by wild animals. The Persian Empire used this method of execution not just to kill prisoners, but to send a message to anyone else who might consider defying royal decrees. Lions were kept hungry for this very purpose, making survival virtually impossible. As they reached the den, King Darius spoke words that revealed the internal conflict he was experiencing. In Daniel chapter 6, verse 16, he said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." Think about the significance of this statement. A pagan king who had just signed a decree demanding that people pray only to him was now calling upon Daniel's God for deliverance. This wasn't just political courtesy or empty words. Darius had witnessed something in Daniel's life that had impressed him deeply. He had seen integrity that couldn't be bought, wisdom that consistently proved reliable, and faith that remained steady regardless of circumstances. Even though Darius didn't share Daniel's beliefs, he recognized that Daniel's God was real and powerful. The mechanics of what happened next were both simple and terrifying. Daniel was lowered into the pit. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, ensuring that no one could tamper with the den or attempt a rescue. And then came the longest night of King Darius's life. The Bible tells us that the king returned to his palace but refused to eat. He couldn't sleep. He dismissed his entertainers and spent the entire night in anguish, probably pacing the floors of his chambers, wondering what he would find when morning came. Meanwhile, down in that dark pit, Daniel was facing a test that would either confirm everything he had believed his entire life or expose his faith as misplaced trust. Imagine being surrounded by hungry lions in complete darkness, knowing that, humanly speaking, there was no way out. No rescue was coming. No one was going to override the king's decree. This was it. But something extraordinary was happening in that den, something that defied natural explanation and challenged everything the conspirators thought they knew about power and control. At the very first light of dawn, King Darius hurried to the lion's den. His heart was probably pounding as he approached. The stone was still in place, the seals unbroken. But what would he find inside? In a voice filled with anguish, he called out, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" And then, from the depths of that pit, came a voice that must have sounded like music to the king's ears. "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." Daniel was alive. Not just alive, but completely unharmed. The lions that should have torn him apart had spent the night as docile as house cats. The God whom Daniel served had indeed rescued him in the most dramatic way imaginable. The king's joy was overwhelming. He immediately ordered Daniel to be lifted out of the den, and when they examined him, they found not a single scratch or mark on his body. The Bible says it was because he had trusted in his God. But the story doesn't end with Daniel's rescue. Justice was about to be served in a way that the conspirators never anticipated. King Darius immediately ordered that the men who had falsely accused Daniel be brought forward. These officials who had crafted the entire scheme, who had manipulated the king's ego to create this trap, were now about to face the very punishment they had designed for Daniel. They were thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children, a harsh reality of ancient justice systems where entire families often paid for the crimes of their heads of household. And, unlike Daniel's miraculous night of protection, these lions immediately attacked and devoured them before they even reached the bottom of the pit. The contrast couldn't have been more stark or more telling. The same lions that had been supernaturally restrained in Daniel's presence showed their true nature when faced with his accusers. This wasn't coincidence, it was vindication of Daniel's innocence and confirmation of divine intervention. But King Darius wasn't finished responding to what he had witnessed. He issued a new decree, this time proclaiming the power of Daniel's God throughout his entire empire. In Daniel chapter 6, verses 26 and 27, his proclamation declared, "I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, his dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth." Think about the remarkable turn of events. What began as a conspiracy to destroy one faithful man ended with the God of Israel being proclaimed throughout one of the world's most powerful empires. Daniel's refusal to compromise his faith had become a platform for displaying God's power to millions of people who had never heard of the true God. This transformation in King Darius reveals something profound about the impact of authentic faith. When people witness genuine integrity under pressure, when they see someone willing to face death rather than abandon their convictions, it forces them to confront questions about their own beliefs and values. Darius had ruled vast territories and commanded mighty armies, but he had never seen anything like what happened in that lion's den. The power he wielded was temporary and limited, but Daniel's God had demonstrated authority over the natural world itself. Daniel's vindication also teaches us something crucial about the long-term consequences of our choices. His accusers thought they were destroying him, but they were actually positioning him for his greatest testimony. Their scheme to eliminate his influence ended up amplifying his voice throughout the known world. The elderly prophet, who had already served faithfully for decades, now entered what might be called the most significant phase of his ministry. Under King Darius's protection and with his explicit endorsement, Daniel continued to prosper and serve. His reputation was no longer just that of a skilled administrator. He was now known throughout the empire as a man whose God performed miracles. But perhaps most importantly, Daniel's experience in the lion's den became a permanent part of human history, recorded for future generations who would face their own tests of faith and courage. His story wasn't preserved just as an interesting historical footnote, but as a source of inspiration and instruction for anyone who might find themselves in similar circumstances. The account forces us to wrestle with uncomfortable questions about our own convictions. What principles are we willing to suffer for? What beliefs are so central to our identity that we would rather face severe consequences than abandon them? When external pressure mounts and the cost of faith becomes personal, how do we respond? Daniel's example challenges the modern tendency to view faith as a private matter that should never interfere with public life or professional responsibilities. His story demonstrates that authentic belief necessarily impacts every area of life, including how we conduct business, treat others, and respond to unjust laws or social pressure. The lion's den wasn't just about one man's miraculous deliverance, it was about the character that made such deliverance possible. Daniel didn't develop courage overnight. His bravery in that final crisis was the result of a lifetime of smaller decisions to honor God, regardless of convenience or cost. Every time he had chosen integrity over advantage, every time he had spoken truth instead of flattery, every time he had maintained his prayer life despite busy schedules or political pressures, Daniel was preparing for this ultimate test. Character, it turns out, isn't built in crisis moments. It's revealed in them. This brings us to a crucial understanding about faith under fire. The question isn't whether we'll face lions in our own lives, but what kind of person we'll be when we do. The lions we face today may not have fangs and claws, but they're just as real and often just as dangerous. They come in the form of career pressure that demands we compromise our values. They appear as social expectations that require us to stay silent about our convictions. They manifest as financial pressures that tempt us to cut ethical corners, or relationship dynamics that push us to abandon our principles for acceptance. Daniel's story forces us to examine our own response to these modern lions. When your boss asks you to falsify reports to meet quarterly targets, what do? When your friends mock your beliefs and pressure you to conform to their lifestyle, how do you respond? When standing up for what's right might cost you a promotion, damage your reputation, or isolate you from your peer group, where do you draw the line? Here's what Daniel understood that many of us miss. The lions in our den are often placed there by people who feel threatened by our integrity. Just as Daniel's colleagues couldn't find fault with his character and had to manufacture a crisis, the opposition we face frequently comes not because we've done something wrong, but because we've consistently done things right. Think about this pattern in your own life. When have you faced the most resistance? Often, it's when you've maintained high standards while others have chosen shortcuts. When you've remained honest while others have bent the truth. When you've treated people with dignity while others have used manipulation or power plays to get ahead. This reality reveals something uncomfortable about human nature and organizational dynamics. Excellence and integrity don't always make you popular, sometimes they make you a target. People who are compromising their own values feel convicted when they're around someone who refuses to compromise theirs. But Daniel's example shows us something powerful about the long-term consequences of standing firm. His refusal to bow to pressure didn't just preserve his personal integrity, it ultimately elevated his influence and expanded his impact. The very crisis that was designed to destroy him became the platform for his greatest testimony. This principle extends far beyond individual benefit. When we maintain our convictions under pressure, we're not just protecting our own character, we're providing hope and inspiration for others who are facing similar struggles. Daniel's story has encouraged millions of people across thousands of years because it demonstrates that it's possible to remain faithful even when everything seems stacked against you. Consider the ripple effects of his decision. King Darius issued a decree proclaiming the power of Daniel's God throughout the entire Persian Empire. Imagine the conversations that must have taken place in homes and marketplaces across that vast territory. People who had never heard of the God of Israel were now discussing the miracle that had taken place in the lion's den. Officials who had been serving under Daniel were probably reflecting on the character they had witnessed in their leader. Citizens who heard the story were questioning their own beliefs and considering what kind of faith could sustain someone through such an ordeal. This is the hidden power of conviction. Under pressure, it creates a testimony that extends far beyond the immediate crisis. When people see someone willing to sacrifice everything for their beliefs, it forces them to examine what they themselves believe and whether those beliefs are worth suffering for. But let's be honest about what this kind of faith costs. Daniel didn't know he would be rescued when he walked into that den. From a human perspective, he was walking to his death. His decision to continue praying wasn't based on a guarantee of miraculous deliverance. It was based on a conviction that remaining faithful to God was more important than preserving his life. This is where many of us struggle with Daniel's example. We want the outcome without the risk. We want to maintain our convictions but avoid the potential consequences. We want to stand for truth, but only when it's convenient and safe. Daniel's story challenges this comfortable approach to faith. It suggests that authentic conviction sometimes requires us to choose principles over safety, integrity over advantage, and faithfulness over survival. This isn't reckless behavior or unnecessary martyrdom. It's the natural result of believing that some things are more important than temporary comfort or security. The question each of us must answer is this: what do we believe strongly enough to suffer for? What principles are so central to our identity that we would rather face severe consequences than abandon them? For Daniel, this wasn't a theoretical question. His commitment to prayer 3 times daily wasn't just a religious routine. It was an expression of his relationship with God and his identity as one of God's people. To abandon this practice would have been to abandon himself. This helps us understand why he didn't look for compromise solutions or try to find creative ways around the decree. The issue wasn't about finding the most practical response to a political crisis. It was about remaining true to who he was, regardless of external circumstances. His consistency in this crisis also reveals something crucial about character development. Daniel didn't suddenly become brave when he faced the lion's den. He had been making courageous choices throughout his entire life, and this final test was simply the culmination of decades of faithful decisions. Every time he had chosen to honor God in small matters, he was building the spiritual muscle that would sustain him in this ultimate challenge. Character, it turns out, isn't developed through dramatic moments, it's revealed through them. The courage we demonstrate in crisis is the result of countless smaller decisions to do what's right when no one is watching. This pattern offers hope for those of us who feel unprepared for major tests of faith. We don't have to wait for a lion's den experience to start building character. We can begin today by choosing integrity in small matters, maintaining our convictions in everyday situations, and developing the habits that will sustain us when larger challenges arise. Daniel's prayer life is a perfect example of this principle. He didn't start praying 3 times daily when the crisis hit. This was already his established pattern. When pressure came, he simply continued doing what he had always done. The crisis didn't change his character, it revealed it. This consistency under pressure also demonstrates something powerful about the nature of true faith. Daniel's relationship with God wasn't compartmentalized or situational. It wasn't something he turned to only in emergencies or set aside when it became inconvenient. His faith was integrated into every aspect of his life, forming the foundation for all his decisions and actions. The conspirators recognized this integration when they concluded that they could only attack Daniel through his relationship with God. They understood that his faith wasn't peripheral to his identity, it was central to everything he did. This recognition led them to create a law that would force Daniel to choose between his civic duties and his religious convictions. But their strategy backfired because they misunderstood the nature of Daniel's faith. They assumed that faced with death, he would prioritize survival over conviction. They calculated that self-preservation would ultimately override religious devotion. They were wrong because they failed to grasp that for Daniel, abandoning his faith would have been a form of spiritual death, far worse than physical destruction. His relationship with God wasn't just one aspect of his life among many. It was the source of meaning and purpose that made life worth living. This understanding transforms how we think about the choices we face. When we truly grasp that our relationship with God is the foundation of our identity and the source of our purpose, other considerations begin to fall into proper perspective. Career advancement, social acceptance, financial security, and even physical safety become secondary to maintaining that fundamental relationship. Daniel's story doesn't minimize these other concerns or suggest they're unimportant. Rather, it demonstrates that when we get our priorities right, everything else finds its proper place. When God is first, we can hold everything else with an open hand, neither grasping desperately nor carelessly discarding the good things he provides. The aftermath of Daniel's deliverance reinforces this principle. Not only was he rescued from the lions, but he continued to prosper under King Darius and later under Cyrus the Persian. His faithfulness in crisis didn't end his career. It enhanced his influence and credibility. This outcome reminds us that God is not only concerned with our spiritual welfare, but with every aspect of our lives. When we honor him in our decisions, he often provides for our practical needs in ways that exceed our expectations. Daniel's promotion and continued success weren't rewards for his faithfulness. They were expressions of God's comprehensive care for those who trust him. But we must be careful not to misinterpret this principle as a guarantee of immediate earthly rewards for faithful behavior. Daniel's story is remarkable precisely because miraculous deliverance isn't the normal expectation. Many faithful people throughout history have faced lions without experiencing supernatural rescue. Their stories are equally important because they demonstrate that faithfulness doesn't depend on favorable outcomes. The true power of Daniel's example lies not in the miracle of his rescue, but in the character that made him willing to face death rather than compromise his convictions. Whether God chooses to deliver us supernaturally or sustain us through suffering, our calling remains the same: to remain faithful regardless of circumstances. This brings us to perhaps the most challenging aspect of Daniel's story for modern believers. We live in a culture that often views compromise as wisdom, flexibility as strength, and absolute convictions as dangerous extremism. The idea that some principles are worth dying for strikes many people as fanatical or unnecessarily rigid. But Daniel's experience reveals the hidden cost of constant compromise. When we consistently bend our principles to accommodate external pressures, we slowly erode the very foundation that gives our lives meaning and direction. Each small compromise makes the next one easier, until we find ourselves far from where we intended to be, wondering how we lost our way. The officials who conspired against Daniel represent this gradual erosion of character. They had likely started their careers with some sense of honor and duty, but years of political maneuvering and ethical flexibility had transformed them into men capable of orchestrating the attempted murder of an innocent colleague. Their willingness to sacrifice Daniel revealed how far they had drifted from basic human decency. This progression happens subtly. It begins with telling small lies to avoid awkward conversations. It continues with cutting minor ethical corners to meet deadlines or quotas. It escalates to ignoring injustice when speaking up might create problems. Eventually, it reaches the point where destroying someone's reputation or livelihood seems like a reasonable solution to professional jealousy. Daniel's consistent faithfulness created a stark contrast to this pattern of moral compromise. His refusal to bend his principles, even in small matters, had preserved his integrity and maintained his relationship with God. When the ultimate test came, he had the spiritual strength to face it because he hadn't weakened himself through years of compromise. This consistency also explains why his enemies found him so threatening. In a system built on mutual compromise and shared corruption, someone with unshakable principles becomes a living rebuke to everyone else's choices. Daniel's presence reminded his colleagues of the standards they had abandoned and the character they had sacrificed for advancement. The same dynamic operates in our contemporary world. When someone consistently tells the truth in an environment built on deception, they become a threat to the entire system. When someone refuses to participate in gossip, office politics, or ethical shortcuts, their presence challenges everyone around them to examine their own behavior. This is why standing for principles often feels lonely and why the pressure to conform can be overwhelming. The people around us have a vested interest in our compromise because our faithfulness highlights their unfaithfulness. Our integrity exposes their lack of integrity. Our willingness to sacrifice for our beliefs challenges their unwillingness to do the same. Daniel's story isn't just ancient history, it's a blueprint for courageous living today. His unwavering faith transformed a death sentence into a testimony that echoed across empires and continues to inspire us thousands of years later. The question isn't whether you'll face your own lions, but whether you'll have the character to face them with integrity. What principles will you refuse to compromise? What convictions will you hold when the cost becomes personal? Start building that character today, because the lions are coming, and when they do, you'll discover what you're truly made of.